This is Photoseries 3. Here we have a mid-sagittal view of the sheep brain. Mid-sagittal cut separates the sheep brain into its two cerebral hemispheres. The corpus callosum, this structure right here, allows for communication between the two cerebral hemispheres. The most posterior portion is the splenium. Moving anterior from the splenium is the body. The most anterior part of the corpus callosum is the genu. If we move anterior from the genu, we encounter the genual gyrus. Anterior from the genual gyrus is the genual sulcus. Going back to the genual gyrus and moving ventrally is the subcallosal gyrus. Going back to the body of the corpus callosum and moving dorsal is the cingulate gyrus. Going back to the splenium and dorsal, we can see a bit of a hippocampal formation, just a bit under. If we go back to the splenium and continue to move anterior and ventrally down, we can see the fornix. Posterior to the fornix is the circular structure right here, and this is called the thalamus. In the center of the thalamus is the massa intermedia. The massa intermedia allows for communication between the two thalamus. Moving ventrally from the thalamus is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is located between the optic chiasm, which is anterior, and the mammillary body, which is posterior to the hypothalamus. Going back to the thalamus, the circular structure, and moving posterior is the habenula. Posterior from the habenula is the penile body. Hanging down and ventral to the penile body is the posterior commissure. Going back to the penile body and moving posterior, we can see the superior colliculus. Ventral to the superior colliculus is the inferior colliculus. Continuing to move ventrally, we can see the midbrain. From the midbrain and moving posterior is the pons. The pons can be indicated by a slight bump. From the pons and moving posterior is the medulla, and from the medulla and posterior is the spinal cord.
We will now take a look at the ventricles. They are through which the cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, travels. The membrane within the corpus callosum is the septum pellucidum. Behind it lies the lateral ventricle. Locate the thalamus and go dorsal to that to find the third ventricle. Trace it towards the anterior to find the interventricular foramen. Ventral to the inferior colliculus is the cerebral aqueduct. Ventral to the cerebellum is the fourth ventricle. So the CSF travels from the lateral ventricles to the interventricular foramen, to the third ventricle, to the cerebral aqueduct, then through the fourth ventricle, and empties out into the spinal canal. However, the CSF can also continue to circulate to the subarachnoid space through the foramina of Magendie and Luschka. We will now take a look at the cerebellum from the mid-sagittal view. The cerebellum lies at the posterior end of the brain. It has really nice cauliflower-like features. Now that's food for thought. The most ventral structure at the base is the lingula. Let's trace the cerebellum in a clockwise direction. So, at the base we have the lingula, and then is the centralis. After that is the culmen. Then it's the primary fissure. Immediately after the primary fissure is the simplex. The protrusion over here is the tuber vermis. Then comes the pyramis, uvulus, and nodulus. After that, you would reach the fourth ventricle floor. We will now take a look at the exterior view of the cerebellum. To distinguish the anterior from the posterior of the cerebellum, Locate the paraflocculus, which is the most lateral structure, and then protruding from that is the flocculus. Follow the direction in which the flocculus points. It points towards the anterior of the cerebellum. So as you can see, this would be the anterior of the cerebellum. At the base, we have the lingula, then the centralis, then the culmen. This groove over here is the primary fissure. After the primary fissure is the simplex. The protrusion over here would be the tuber vermis. After that comes the perimus, uvulus, and nodulus. The nodulus is the most ventral structure. You cannot see it when the cerebellum is attached to the brain. That is because the nodulus folds inwards. The medial structure is the tuber vermis. Lateral to that, and more rostral, would be the ansiform lobule. Lateral to the tuber vermis, and more caudal, would be the paramedian lobule. The most lateral structure is the paraflocculus, and more anterior and medial to that is the flocculus. The anterior structures can also be generalized as the anterior lobule. They include the lingula, centralis, and culmen. The posterior structures behind the tuber vermis are generalized as the posterior median lobule. So they include the perimus, uvulus, and nodulus. And that concludes Photoseries 3.